To the other guests at the Harrington Gala, I was invisible. That's the thing about working coat check. At a black tie event, you become part of the furniture. People hand you their coats without looking at your face. They talk freely in front of you because you don't count. You're not a person at the party. You're a service. My name is Tatum. I'd been working the coat check at the Harrington Hotel for 11 months. Before that, I worked the front desk at a downtown law firm. Before that, a receptionist at a private equity office in the Loop. I had a very specific skill set. I knew how to be unnoticed in rooms full of powerful people. I knew how to listen without appearing to listen. I knew how to remember everything I heard. That skill set had a purpose that had nothing to do with hospitality. The night of the Crawford Capital Gala, I arrived 90 minutes early. I set up my station with the little numbered tags and the velvet hangers and the folded claim tickets, and I positioned myself exactly the way I'd practiced. From where I stood, I had a direct sightline into the main ballroom through the arch at the far end of the foyer. I could see the bar. I could see the entrance to the private dining room. I could see the elevator bank. I could see everything I needed to see. I wasn't there for the tips. He arrived at 8:14. I recognized him immediately, even though I'd only seen photographs. Photographs don't fully capture a man like Spencer Holt. Not the way he moved through a room, unhurried and certain. The kind of certainty that comes from 30 years of never being told no. He was 61, silver at the temples, taller than I expected. His wife was on his arm. She was beautiful in a careful way, in a dove-gray gown that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. She smiled at something he said as they crossed the foyer, and the smile looked practiced. Her name was Claudette. She'd been married to Spencer for 22 years. They had one daughter. Her name was Phoebe. Phoebe was the reason I was standing behind a coat check counter in a pair of shoes that gave me blisters. I watched Spencer and Claudette move into the ballroom. I watched the crowd part for them. I watched the way other men straightened when he approached, the way women touched their pearls, the way waitstaff recalibrated their routes to avoid crossing his path. Spencer Holt ran the most influential private equity firm in the Midwest. He sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and 2 universities. He chaired the annual fundraiser for a children's literacy program that his wife had founded. He was photographed at charity events and written up in business magazines, and described in profiles as a self-made man who had never forgotten where he came from. Every single word of it was a lie. Not the self-made part. That was probably true. What he'd made himself into. That was the part the magazines didn't print. I'd spent 14 months learning the difference. Phoebe was my college roommate. We met freshman year at Northwestern, placed together by the housing algorithm into a double room in Willard Hall. She had a tapestry on her wall and a collection of used paperbacks, and the best laugh I'd ever heard in my life. This enormous, unself-conscious sound that didn't match her small frame at all. We stayed up until 3 a.m, our first week talking about everything. We became the kind of friends that happen fast and hold forever. Or I thought they did. Her father's money made her life soft in ways she didn't always notice, but Phoebe herself was not soft. She worked hard. She called her parents every Sunday. She never talked about the house in Lake Forest or the condo in Aspen unless someone asked. When she graduated, she went to work for a nonprofit that did housing advocacy on the South Side. She didn't have to do that. She chose to. That's who she was. I need you to understand who she was before I tell you what happened to her. 14 months ago, Phoebe called me from a parking lot at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I could hear in her voice that she'd been crying for a while before she picked up the phone. That specific hollowness that comes after the tears run out. She told me that her father had come to her 2 weeks earlier with a business proposition. He was facing a liquidity crisis, not bankruptcy. Not quite, but the kind of cash flow problem that happens when you've overextended on 3 major acquisitions simultaneously. He needed a short-term infusion. He knew Phoebe had her grandmother's trust. She'd turned 30 the year before and received access to it. $460,000 that her grandmother had saved and invested over 40 years in a small house in Wisconsin, skipping vacations and clipping coupons and believing, with the absolute faith of her generation, that you built something for the people who came after you. Spencer told Phoebe it was temporary. He told her it would be back in 6 months with a return. He told her he was asking her, not requiring it, but the way he asked. She said the way he asked didn't leave a lot of room for no. She transferred the money. That was 8 months before the phone call. She'd been asking for updates for 4 months. He kept reassuring her. The timeline extended. The language got vague. And then, 2 weeks before she called me, she overheard a conversation. Her father on a phone call in his study. She'd come home for the weekend. She wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday, but she'd finished early. She was standing in the hallway, and the door was open an inch, and she heard him say her name. Not with love, with calculation. She heard him tell whoever was on the other end of that call that the trust money was already integrated into the restructuring, and that Phoebe wouldn't be a problem. That she'd understand. That by the time she figured out the timeline, it would be too late to recover the principal anyway. She heard him say, "She's not going to make a scene. She never does." She stood in that hallway for 5 minutes without moving. Then she went back out the front door as quietly as she'd come in and drove to a parking lot and called me. I asked her what she wanted to do. She said she didn't know. She said she loved her father. She said she kept trying to find an explanation that made what she heard make sense in a different way. I told her I'd help her figure it out. I meant something different than she thought. I'm not going to explain everything I did over the next 14 months. Some of it isn't relevant. Some of it I'm not proud of. What I'll say is this. I stopped working at the law firm and found work that let me get close to the circles. Spencer Holt moved in without being visible. I learned his patterns. I learned who his partners were, which ones had started asking uncomfortable questions, which ones had gotten quiet in ways that meant they were preparing to exit quietly with whatever they could recover. I learned that Spencer had a very specific way of handling problems that got too close to him. He didn't fight. He redirected. He created situations where the problem person had something to lose, and then he made sure they understood that losing it was on the table. He was elegant about it. He almost never got his own hands dirty. Almost. The one time he had, I'd found evidence of it in a document that passed through the copy room of a firm I'd done 2 months of temp work for. A settlement. Confidential. Non-disclosure. A former business partner named Gerald Ashby, who had tried to go to the SEC about some irregularities in a 2019 fund and then, 11 days later, dropped the complaint and signed away his right to ever discuss it. Gerald Ashby had a daughter in middle school. The settlement was signed 3 days after Spencer Holt had a lunch meeting with Gerald Ashby's brother-in-law, who turned out to be the business partner of Gerald Ashby's ex-wife, who had primary custody. I don't know exactly what was said in that meeting. I don't have to know. I understood by then who I was dealing with. The thing I needed, the thing I'd been waiting for, was a moment when Spencer Holt was in a room with people who had the right kind of power to do something with what I knew, and when I could get close enough to hand it to them without it looking like I was handing it to them. The Harrington Gala was that moment. 3 of the people on the guest list were attorneys who worked in the financial fraud division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. One of them I recognized from a photograph in a news article about a conviction that had taken down a hedge fund manager 2 years earlier. His name was in the program under a table sponsorship. He was not there on official business. He was there because he'd been a Northwestern alumni donor since 1994, and this was his annual gala, and he'd attended every year for a decade. He was also, according to a property record I'd looked up in June, the person who had purchased the house next door to Gerald Ashby in 2020 and sold it in 2022. That was a thread I'd pulled on for 6 weeks before I understood what it meant. Gerald Ashby had talked, not to the SEC, to someone he trusted more, and that person had spent 2 years building a case. What he might not have was what I had. The document from the copy room, the patterns I'd mapped, the timeline of Phoebe's trust, and how it connected to 3 other instances of the same structure across different investors, different family members, different amounts. I had a flash drive in the left pocket of my uniform apron. Spencer and Claudette sat down to dinner at 8:45. They were at table 7, which I could see through the arch if I leaned 2 inches to the left. There were 8 people at the table, mostly board members and their spouses. Conversation, Whine. The kind of laughter that happens in rooms where everyone is comfortable. Claudette laughed at something the woman next to her said, and touched her husband's arm. I wondered if she knew. I'd wondered that for months. I'd gone back and forth on it. There were moments in my research when I found things that suggested she might. A transfer that routed through an account in her name, a real estate entity that she was listed as a co-signatory on, and then there were moments that suggested the opposite. Emails forwarded to a personal address, questions she'd asked in writing that were answered with reassurances. She'd been asking questions too. Maybe different ones, maybe for different reasons, maybe for the same reasons. I didn't know. And because I didn't know, I'd made a decision about her that I was still not entirely sure was right. At 9:20, I saw him. The man I was waiting for had arrived late. He came in from the side entrance, the one that the hotel staff used, the one that wasn't on the main floor plan, the one that I knew existed because I'd worked a prep shift here 3 weeks earlier to learn the layout. He was in a tuxedo that fit like it had been tailored in the last week. And he was alone, and he moved like someone who had been trained to move through rooms without attracting attention. His name was in the program. Table 12. Federal prosecutor, though the program listed him under a foundation name rather than his title. I had maybe a 90-minute window before dinner ended and the crowd started thinning. I had to time this exactly right. The first thing I did was wait for Spencer to leave the table. He did, at 9:40. Men like Spencer always step away from the dinner table at Gaulis. There's networking to do. Conversations that are better had standing up with a drink in hand, away from spouses and table partners. He moved toward the bar on the far side of the ballroom. I watched the trajectory. He stopped to talk to someone near the window. Then someone else. He was moving in the general direction of the cluster, near the far doors, where a lot of the board-level people had gathered. He was going to be away from the table for at least 20 minutes. I signaled the coat check assistant I'd befriended in my first week, a pre-law student named Demi, who I'd subtly cultivated for exactly this kind of moment. I told her I needed to step away for a few minutes. She nodded without looking up from her phone. I walked into the ballroom. Getting to table 12 required crossing most of the room, which I didn't want to do. Instead, I took the long route through the perimeter, staying close to the wall, pausing twice to adjust a curtain tie back and pick up a cocktail napkin from the floor. Invisible, purposeful, just staff. He was seated with 3 other people, but they were all engaged in their own conversation. He had his phone face down on the table and was turning his wine glass by the stem, not drinking it, watching the room. He saw me coming when I was still 10 feet away. I know because his eyes shifted and then went still in a particular way. Not suspicious, just noting. He was the kind of person who noted things. I reached the table. I leaned down, the way you do when you're delivering a message to someone at a dinner table, and I said, quietly, near his ear, "Sir, I think you've been waiting a long time for what's in my left pocket. It's yours if you meet me at coat check in 4 minutes." I straightened up. I didn't look at his face. I walked back the way I'd come. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my throat. I made it back to coat check with 90 seconds to spare. Demi handed me a claim ticket without commentary and went back to scrolling. I stood at the counter and I waited. He came at 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He didn't approach like someone approaching a coat check. He approached like someone who'd come to retrieve his jacket. He set a ticket on the counter. I already had a jacket ready on the hanger. I'd put a spare there an hour ago for exactly this reason. I handed him the jacket. "The flash drive was taped inside the left cuff," I said, quietly, not looking at him. "Phoebe Holt. Her grandmother's trust. There are 4 others like her. The document in the Ashby settlement links back to the 2019 fund. It's all on there, with the timeline." He didn't respond immediately. He put on the jacket slowly. He turned the cuff over in his hands like he was checking the fit. Then he said, even quieter than I had, "How long did this take you?" 14 months, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does she know you're here?" "No," I said. "She thinks I moved to Seattle." He looked at me then, directly, for the first time, not unkindly. "You should have come to us," he said. "It would have been faster." "You didn't have enough," I said. "Now you do." He held my gaze for a second. Then he gave a slight nod, the kind that doesn't mean thank you so much as I understand what this cost. He took his jacket and walked toward the exit. I went back to the counter. My hands were shaking slightly. I pressed them flat on the counter surface and breathed out slowly. I thought about Phoebe in her parking lot 14 months ago, her voice hollowed out from crying. I thought about her grandmother's house in Wisconsin, the small rooms and the careful savings and the 40 years of faith that something would be waiting. I thought about Spencer Holt at table 7, laughing at someone's joke, easy in his skin, surrounded by people who had no idea. Not for much longer, I thought. The rest of the evening was quiet. The way evenings are quiet when the important thing has already happened, and the world just hasn't caught up yet. Claudette came to retrieve her wrap at 10:45. She handed me her ticket and smiled the automatic smile of someone who has been smiling all evening. I handed her the wrap. She was turning to go when she stopped. She turned back. She looked at me. Actually looked at me, the way almost no one had all evening. "You've been here all night," she said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes, ma'am." She studied me for a moment. I don't know what she saw. I kept my face neutral. Then she said quietly, not like she was asking me, but like she was saying something she'd been holding. "Whatever you know, I hope it leads somewhere." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and walked back toward the ballroom. I stood there for a moment, very still. Then I took a breath and started straightening the hangers. The indictment came down 6 months later. I found out the way most people did, a news alert on my phone at 6:53 in the morning. I was making coffee in my apartment. I read the notification twice, and then I set my phone face down on the counter and finished making the coffee and drank it standing at the window, watching the street come to life below. Spencer Holt, 4 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of investor misappropriation. The filing referenced multiple victims, including family members who had contributed personal trust assets. It didn't name Phoebe, but it would. She called me that afternoon. I hadn't spoken to her in 8 months. We'd drifted in the way I'd let us drift. I'd pulled back slowly, excuses here and there, distance that I'd manufactured because I couldn't tell her what I was doing, and I couldn't look her in the face and pretend I wasn't doing it. It hurt more than I'd expected. It hurt in the specific way that things hurt when you're causing the pain on purpose, for someone else's sake. She called, and I picked up immediately. She said my name, and then she was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Did you know?" I said yes. She was quiet for a long time. I listened to her breathe. Then she said, "How long?" I told her. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute. I didn't rush her. I sat with the silence the way you sit with something that deserves sitting with. Finally, she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know what he'd do if he found out you were asking questions," I said. "I know what he did to Gerald Ashby. I wasn't going to let that happen near you." Another silence. "You let me think you'd moved to Seattle," she said. And in her voice was something complicated. Not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. The kind of feeling that comes when someone you trusted kept a secret, and the secret was for you and you're not sure if you get to be upset about it anyway. "I know," I said. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," I said again. She breathed out slowly. "Tatum. Yeah. Did you do this alone?" "Mostly. For 14 months. Yes." She made a sound that I couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't crying. It was something between those things, something exhausted and overwhelmed, and maybe, underneath it, something that was going to eventually be okay. "You're insane," she said. "Probably," I said. "I'm angry at you," she said. "I need you to know that. That's fair. And I need to see you. Tell me when." She came to my apartment 2 days later. She stood in my kitchen, and I made her the same coffee I'd been making myself when I read the news alert, and we sat at my small table, and she asked me every question she'd been carrying, and I answered every single one of them. No deflection, no redirection. She deserved that. At one point she asked me why. Not why I'd investigated. She understood that. She meant why I'd done it without telling her. Why I'd decided that alone. I thought about how to answer that, honestly. "Because the moment you knew what I was doing," I said, "you'd have had to carry it. And you were already carrying enough." She looked at me across the table. "That wasn't your decision to make," she said. "I know," I said. "I made it anyway." She was quiet. Then, how did it feel? 14 months of that? I thought about the copy room, and the temp work, and the coat check counter, and the 90 seconds of standing there waiting, and my hands pressed flat against the surface to stop the shaking. Like something I had to finish, I said. She nodded slowly. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. My grandmother saved that money for 38 years, she said. Her voice was even, but just barely. She never spent a vacation on herself. She drove the same car for 14 years. She used to reuse the wrapping paper from Christmas presents. I know, I said quietly. The prosecutors say recovery is possible. Civil action on top of the criminal. Maybe 60–70% of the principal. I know, I said. That's not the point. I know, I said again. She looked up at me. She died 3 years before I got access to that trust. She never knew me as an adult, really. And the last concrete thing she left me was... She stopped. She shook her head. He just took it. Like it was a resource to be managed. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I just stayed there with her in the quiet of that. After a while, she said, "Thank you. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. And I'm still angry. Those two things can both be true." I almost smiled. "Yeah," I said. "They can." Claudette Holt issued a statement through her attorney the week after the indictment. She separated from her husband and cooperated with investigators. The statement was brief and carefully worded and didn't say much. But one line stayed with me when I read it. She said she had suspected something was wrong for longer than she was prepared to admit, and that she was sorry it had taken this long. I thought about her at the coat check, her wrap around her shoulders, looking at me with those tired eyes. Whatever you know, I hope it leads somewhere. She had known something. Maybe not the specifics, but she had known. I didn't know how to feel about that. I still don't entirely. It's the part of this that doesn't resolve cleanly. Most things don't. The trial is scheduled for early next year. Phoebe has been subpoenaed to testify. She told me she's ready. She said it, with the particular steadiness of someone who has had time to convert grief into resolve, which is the only alchemy that actually works. She also told me she's been talking to 2 of the other victims' families. Quietly. Just talking. She said some of them had the same experience. Not the details, but the feeling of it. The way the ask was phrased so that no felt impossible. The way the reassurances were calibrated perfectly to delay the realization. He practiced it, she said. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He got so good at it that it stopped feeling like a choice. It was still a choice, I said. I know, she said. But I think about that sometimes. The difference between someone who does a bad thing and someone who has done it so many times that they've made it into a system. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I'm back at a law firm now. Different one. Front desk. It's a long way from the Harrington Hotel coat check. And also, in all the ways that matter, it's exactly the same view. People talk in front of me like I'm not there. I'm always there. I don't know what's going to come of the trial. I don't know what percentage of the trust Phoebe will recover, or whether the civil action will succeed, or what Claudette Holt's life looks like on the other side of all this. I don't know what happens to a man like Spencer when the room stops parting for him, whether he feels it as a loss or just as a new problem to be managed. Some things you do without knowing what the ending looks like. You do them because the alternative is not doing them. You do them because sometimes the most powerful thing in a room is the person nobody's watching. Phoebe texted me last week. Just a photograph, no caption. It was a picture of a wrapping paper bow, slightly crumpled, the kind you peel off and save to reuse. She'd found a box of them in her closet. She told me when I asked. Her grandmother's. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I sent back, "I'm keeping you close," she replied. "I know."